Hello, I'm Henry Keane. We are UATV and you are welcome to the News Pulse. Today in the episode, historic hit. Ukraine takes out Russia's B-12 planes and helicopters in occupied Crimea.
They waited until the music started. In the early hours of a fog-covered morning on the Black Sea coast, Russian commanders gathered at a newly fortified oil port, a gleaming monument to Moscow's claim that its war machine was untouchable. The air buzzed with pride and vodka-fueled laughter. Flags waved, medals shone under floodlights, and a military band struck up the Russian anthem as generals toasted the invincibility of the fleet. What no one knew was that 1,000 miles away, Ukrainian eyes were watching every movement through satellite feeds and intercepted phone calls. Kyiv had been waiting for this celebration for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This superport, as Russia's state media had dubbed it, sat on the occupied Crimean coastline, rebuilt after repeated Ukrainian drone attacks. It served as both an oil terminal and a logistics hub for refueling warships heading into the Black Sea. Tankers full of diesel arrived from refineries in Russia proper, and armored trains unloaded endless fuel containers. Engineers bragged that the new facility was missile-proof, protected by layered air defenses and electronic jammers. But Ukraine's intelligence knew something Russia didn't. Those defenses were blind for just a few minutes each night when radar calibration switched systems. And that's when the plan took shape. Weeks before the blast, Ukrainian special operators infiltrated Crimea's shoreline disguised as fishermen. They planted underwater sensors and placed signal beacons near the docks. At the same time, cyber units in Kyiv hacked into the port's communication network, monitoring when senior officers planned to visit. What they discovered stunned them. A full-scale ceremony to mark the completion of the port's expansion. Dozens of high-ranking commanders would be present, including the admiral overseeing fuel supply for the Black Sea Fleet. The moment they toasted success, the port would become a target the world couldn't ignore. On the night of the celebration, the port glittered like a small city. Strings of lights reflected off massive fuel tanks, and trains loaded with diesel sat parked along the rails. Inside the control tower, officers joked that Ukraine wouldn't dare attack now, not with so many generals here. But deep in an underground room in southern Ukraine, operators monitored a live drone feed. The countdown had begun. 6 long-range naval drones, black, low-profile craft packed with explosives, glided silently across the water, guided by GPS and remote operators hundreds of kilometers away. Their engines barely rippled the waves. Above them, reconnaissance drones hovered high enough to seem like distant stars. The first explosion came at 11:42 p.m. It was so sudden that most of the officers didn't realize what had happened. A white flash erupted from the far end of the dock, followed by a shockwave that shattered windows half a mile away. Seconds later, the second drone slammed into a diesel tanker, igniting a fireball that climbed hundreds of feet into the sky. Panic spread through the crowd. Some ran toward the ships. Others froze, unsure if it was an accident. Then came the third and fourth blasts, precise, surgical hits on the loading cranes and main fuel lines. Within minutes, the entire port was engulfed in flames. But Ukraine's strike didn't end there. As Russian emergency crews scrambled, a hidden second phase began. On shore, explosives that had been buried weeks earlier beneath the railway tracks detonated in sequence. The shock tore apart the locomotives that had been delivering the fuel, the same trains that moments earlier had carried officers to the celebration. Massive containers exploded like grenades, scattering twisted steel and burning diesel across the complex. For 30 minutes, the sky above Crimea burned orange, visible even from across the sea in Odessa. When the smoke cleared, satellite images revealed devastation on a scale Russia hadn't suffered in months. The superport's main fuel reserves, more than 1,000 tons of diesel, had been completely destroyed. The explosion cratered the rail lines, melted cranes, and sent a shockwave powerful enough to capsize nearby patrol boats. Russian emergency services called it an accident, but video from residents told another story, a coordinated strike that crippled one of Moscow's most valuable military assets. In Moscow, the news was met with fury and disbelief. The Kremlin tried to spin the attack as a minor setback, claiming that most of the port remains operational. But internal reports leaked to Ukrainian intelligence painted a different picture. It would take months to restore basic functionality. Without the port, the Black Sea Fleet's fuel logistics were in chaos. Warships stranded in Sevastopol couldn't sail for lack of supply. Even ground operations in southern Ukraine began to slow as diesel convoys were rerouted hundreds of kilometers inland. For Kyiv, the operation wasn't just about destruction, it was psychological warfare. The timing had been deliberate. By striking during a moment of triumph, Ukraine humiliated Moscow in front of its own officers. The attack proved that no amount of rebuilding could hide Crimea's vulnerability. "We didn't just hit a port," one Ukrainian officer later told a local newspaper. "We hit their confidence." In the aftermath, satellite photos circulated on Telegram channels showed the port's coastline scorched black. Charred railcars lay like toys beside collapsed fuel tanks. Russian state TV avoided showing the damage, instead broadcasting footage of officials handing out medals to surviving personnel. But whispers spread through military ranks about the admiral who was thrown into the sea by the blast wave, the soldiers who vanished in the inferno, and the rescue teams who refused to enter the still-burning site for fear of secondary explosions. Western analysts described the strike as one of the most sophisticated Ukrainian operations of the year. The use of coordinated naval drones, cyber interference, and planted explosives demonstrated a level of integration usually reserved for major NATO powers. It marked another evolution in Ukraine's asymmetric warfare: precision over numbers, intelligence over brute force. Each strike now carried not just physical damage but a message. Russia could build, rebuild, and boast, but Ukraine could still reach out and destroy when it mattered most. Inside Russia, the political fallout was immediate. Hardline bloggers accused the defense ministry of incompetence. "How can we hold ceremonies in the middle of a war?" One post fumed, gathering millions of views before being deleted. Another commentator compared the explosion to a second Moskva, referring to the warship Ukraine sank earlier in the conflict. For the families of the soldiers stationed at the port, the silence from the government was unbearable. Many never received official confirmation of deaths, only that their loved ones were missing in action. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the mood was quietly celebratory. Officials didn't claim responsibility outright, but President Zelensky posted a cryptic message hours later: "When you celebrate in occupied lands, remember, someone is watching the fireworks." It was enough to confirm what everyone already knew. Within hours, the post went viral across social media, accompanied by videos of the explosion that lit up the Crimean sky. Recovery efforts in Crimea dragged on for weeks. Russian engineers tried to salvage what they could, but the intense heat had warped metal foundations and contaminated the surrounding soil with thousands of liters of burned fuel. Fishing villages miles away reported dead fish washing ashore. The air smelled of chemicals for days. Crews worked around the clock to clear debris, but every time they began repairs, new Ukrainian drone attacks targeted the supply convoys. It became a nightmare of attrition: rebuild, get hit again, rebuild, get hit again. The attack also disrupted Russian morale far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers at front lines started questioning why their commanders were celebrating while they lacked fuel and supplies. Telegram groups filled with angry messages blaming senior officers for throwing parties while men die in trenches. In one intercepted call, a Russian tanker driver could be heard shouting, "They're drinking diesel while we're dying for it." In Washington and London, intelligence officials watched the aftermath closely. Analysts praised Ukraine's timing as strategic theater. Hitting the port during a celebration amplified global impact far beyond the material damage. It sent a warning that the era of impunity in occupied Crimea was over, that no ribbon-cutting or military parade was beyond reach. As days turned into weeks, Russia's attempts to rebuild the superport grew desperate. They moved operations inland, constructed makeshift fuel depots, and stationed air defenses around them. But Ukraine kept adapting, striking supply lines instead of facilities, forcing the Kremlin to spread resources thin. The once boasted, invulnerable logistics network now looked like a chain of fragile targets waiting to burn. Eyewitnesses later described the night of the explosion as apocalyptic.